up the, because there's 4 items on your city
No,
council
I'll
agenda.
open the city council and go
Fair
through
enough.
it at that point.
Okay.
Hi, Michelle.
Not my presentation, but thought I'd get it ready. Good evening, agency chair and members of the agency board. Michelle de Guzman, Economic Development and Housing Department. This presentation tonight is on the Parking Policy Management and Implementation Plan. In 2006, the City Council and Planning Commission convened a joint meeting to discuss various aspects of parking policy and subsequently issued a request for proposals to consultants to provide parking research services. The goal of that RFP was to establish policies that would establish goals to reduce solo driving while maintaining economic vitality, improve parking lot garage maneuverability and efficiency, and coordinate and manage the public and private on and off-street parking. In 2007, the City Council and agency selected Wilbur Smith Associates to prepare the parking policy and management implementation plan to accomplish these goals in a pilot project in the North Hollis area. The findings for that pilot project were presented in December 2008, and at that time, the City Council directed staff to they provided some additional comment and then directed staff to expand the parking study to the rest of the city. Wilbur Smith Associates has completed that analysis and integrated those findings into a final parking policy and management implementation plan. Staff requests that the agency provide comments on the parking policy and management plan, which will be presented to you shortly by Wilbur Smith. And as you listen to the presentation, keep in mind staff's recommendations of delaying the implementation of the parking policy until the economy recovers, and including the cost of meter installation as a project to be considered in the capital improvement program funding when that program is updated later on. With that, I would like to introduce Bill Hurl from Wilbur Smith Associates.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and Mayor and council members. Very nice to be back before you again to talk about the parking management plan. What I'd like to do tonight is basically sort of refresh your memories and also just go through all the specifics of the proposal with you. Our presentation is going to focus on the goals of the program, the methodology, the elements of the plan itself, phasing and implementation, and of course the dollars and cents issues, and then also what we recommend in terms of the next steps for the project. We actually were given the following goals by the City Council that came out of the workshop that Michelle mentioned back in 2006, and it was to improve efficiency of commercial parking, protect residential parking, protect the viability of historic industrial areas, and overall to lower dependence on autos, particularly by employees. Our study involved a multi-level methodology, including surveys, data collection, and again, as Michelle mentioned, we had 2 phases, what we called the North Hollis area, and then the phase 2, which really addressed the rest of the city in terms of the areas that would be logical for potential parking management. We held a number of public meetings with the Chamber of Commerce and Transportation Management Agency. We had some study sessions with you in 2008 and 2009. And also alongside all this, we went through an evaluation process of a number of alternatives that we looked at, and looking at them in terms of how well they performed, in terms of managing parking, and then to complement that, what are the financial implications of the different alternatives. The parking management plan itself focused on resolving some pretty fundamental parking issues that we found. In doing our parking surveys, we found that, particularly in the north of Hollis area, which is the area from Powell Street to the north, that area, many of the on-street parking spaces at peak times are occupied 90% or more, so actually in excess of their what we call practical capacity. We also found that many of the off-street facilities, primarily the private ones, were actually not very heavily occupied, that there was quite a bit of surplus private parking capacity off-street. In addition to that, we found that in the residential area to the east, it's sort of the buffer between the commercial area and the city of Oakland, that although there was fairly intense parking activity on the streets there, it wasn't really at the level that required any special control at this point, at least not overall. In some of the blocks it was pretty busy, but not overall. So we had those sort of basic problems, and I think there was one more that we noted, which was for the industrial area to the north, is that because that area doesn't have formalized curbs and gutters, it doesn't really present itself very well for strict parking management or pricing, because there really aren't well identified parking spaces, places to post signs, places to put parking revenue collection equipment, and so forth. Plus, there was quite a reaction from the interest in that area that this type of activity would actually hamper the industrial-related activities that go on there right now. And of course, one of our goals was not to upset the historic aspects of that area. The plan, first, we developed, as you may recall, the north of Hollis portion first, and then when we looked on the citywide basis, we looked to the area south of Powell Street. And what we found really was there was only a small portion of the city that really had intense enough parking activity to warrant it being included. And so the area that you see on the map south of Powell, that's the only area that we recommended that should be included. And so it sort of makes a nice cohesive district, with the Powell Street being somewhat of a barrier, but the area does somewhat flow together. The recommendations, first, what we call variable on-street parking, and I'll say a little bit more about how that works in a minute, but it included short-term parking spaces, which are identified in pink, I believe, on the map, and they're specifically located to be in front of businesses that generate short-term parking activity, so restaurants, shops, and so forth, where the merchants would like to see high turnover parking. Then the long-term parking, which would be for employees and residents, and these are the areas where we noted that there wasn't much turnover in the parking right now, and that the uses in those areas typically were either residential or employment-oriented, so that most of the people parking there were longer-term parkers. So we split it into those two. The residential zone we identified as having the potential for a residential permit program, somewhat similar to the one you already have on a very limited basis right now. We also actually took into consideration a plan that was proposed at that time for development of a bus corridor on Hollis Street, which would be actually to have removed parking during the peak time, so there'd be more capacity in the street for buses. I realize some of the things about that have changed since some of the bus service, I believe AC Transit isn't there anymore, but that was really, we were incorporating that element into our plan. It wasn't necessarily part of the plan, and the plan will function fine with or without those recommendations. So those were the basic provisions. Well, the other one was the industrial parking zone, and that I think, as I've already implied, we decided not to change the parking restrictions in that area, just leave them as is. Phasing is a really big part of the program. We've had a lot of experience with helping cities implement parking pricing, and pricing is a very powerful tool. It will move people around, change their habits, and so even though we do our best to identify what we think is going to happen, it's always best to take it in steps so you can observe what happens and then adjust accordingly as time goes on. So we proposed really 4 phases of development. The first phase would be implementing the pricing mechanism in the short term, those spaces identified for short-term parking. And then there'd be a period of monitoring that, roughly a 6-month period, monitoring that, and if adjustments were needed, you could make those. Then, after that, to implement the rest of the pricing, which would be for the area for all the long-term pricing. And again, there'd be monitoring, in particular then with most of the parking now in the commercial area now under a pricing mechanism to monitor the residential area to make sure that we're not impacting them. And if we were, then you would go to the residential permit parking on an expanded basis. The pricing mechanism is what's called variable pricing. And the idea of variable pricing is to use the cost of the parking to influence people's behavior rather than use strict regulation. So, for example, for the short-term parking, in the beginning, as it shows, in the first hour it would be $1 per hour, second hour it would be $1 per hour, and then it would increase. So people could stay longer if they wanted to, but they would be essentially have to pay the higher price. So the price itself would be the thing that would discourage them from staying. That avoids some of the negative aspects of a lot of parking pricing systems where if you stay a few minutes over, let's say 2 hours, you get a ticket, so forth. It also makes it easier on the enforcement officers. They only have to enforce when the fee hasn't been paid. They don't have to enforce when somebody did pay the fee but it stayed too long. The long-term pricing would be less expensive, but it would graduate up to a total cost related to about $4.50 per day in phase 1. So the daily price of parking would be that, and you can see that parking isn't variable. It's a constant rate throughout because we really are not trying to discourage people from staying longer in this case because it's long-term parking. So those are the basic concepts. And then the prices would go up gradually, or at least hypothetically go up gradually as the phases were implemented. Although, as we mentioned, with the monitoring and adjustment, you would have the option of not doing that, or frankly, of going higher if you wanted to. As far as implementing the program, three basic steps. There's still some more planning work to be done, and there's some installation steps, and then finally there's the monitoring that I talked about. So the planning is just to confirm the boundaries of the areas to be where the pricing is to be implemented, to approve the pricing plan itself, to select the technology to be used to collect the money, which the technology that we've been talking about is which are essentially multi-space parking meters or parking pay stations. You've seen them now probably in Berkeley and Oakland. They're very prevalent now.
Right.
There's a variety of those around, different types. To determine how to fund it, because up front, as you'll see in a minute, there's a capital expense that's involved. To develop the internal administrative framework within the city, because there's some staffing requirements for the parking program. And then the last thing, but in some ways the most important, is the public outreach and public information program. If you listen to what has happened over in Oakland with their parking initiatives, you know that it's very important to make a clear message, understandable message about what this program is about. It's not about raising revenue. It's about managing the parking, a limited, strict resource. It's about creating better turnover for businesses. It's about making better use of that private off-street parking that currently is not being utilized. So those are the kinds of things. As far as the installation goes, there has to be, we did identify some potential locations for the meters. These have to be confirmed. There has to be a process of selecting a vendor for the equipment. There needs to be, once you do implement it, there needs to be the monitoring that I talked about. in the short-term area, and then, of course, longer term, when you implement that program, there will also be monitoring. And the monitoring is very important, and some of the technology that is available could help that because there are certain costs involved. But knowing what's going on the street is critical to this type of program. The other aspect of this is the residential permit parking program. And again, this program, we actually hope that you won't need to do this. But if you do need to do it, if there is overspill, then there is a process that you have to go through, and it involves soliciting the input of the actual residents as to whether or not they are interested in having the parking, confirming that there is enough of a problem in the area to warrant it, because if you don't have, the parking doesn't fill up over 75%, there's still enough parking that they're really, why impose this problem on everybody? Because it isn't a positive thing. It's an inconvenience to a certain extent to have to buy these permits and post them on your vehicles and so forth. And then there'd be the pricing plan and the technology again to be selected. Our proposal was to limit the number of permits because we don't want to oversell, so we make people pay for these permits, and then when they go to park they can't find a space. So the idea was to limit them roughly to the amount of parking that's available. There also is the concept of selling a limited number of business permits in the area. The residential permit area would only allow 2-hour parking by those that don't have a permit, but there would be enough capacity, we believe, to actually sell some permits to employees and allow them to park there without challenging the amount of supply available. And that could be a very positive thing in terms of balancing the parking, because many of these people do park there right now. And then, of course, there'd be a 2-hour time limit for visitors. In terms of the dollars and cents, we've broken it out by the phases and capital costs, staffing, and then the revenue to be involved and the net income. In the first phase, all we're doing is implementing the short-term meters, and it costs a little over $400,000 for the equipment. There are some staffing requirements. You need at least a full-time person and a little bit more than that. For the annualized cost would be $135,000 a year. That's when we spread the capital cost out over a 10-year period. And then the revenue that would come in annualized would, I think, over an 8-year period would be $162,000.
If I could just interrupt, Bill, I'm sorry, I loaded the wrong table on.
Did you?
So I'm going to show the correct table on the overhead.
Oh. Is that going to work?
Can you zoom in? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, so far all the numbers that I've mentioned are the same. So the net income then would be, during the first phase, we'd expect a relatively small income, $26,000 a year. Where things start ramping up is with the second phase, where the capital costs get close to $1.3 million. These are, by the way, we're combining the costs as we go along, so it's phases 1 and 2 combined there for $1.3 million. The staffing would go up to about 3.5 individuals. This is for maintenance of the equipment, for enforcement, for all the activities, and this is included in the cost. The annualized cost would go up to $380,000, but because now we're covering a much bigger area, the revenue goes up to almost $850,000. So there'd be about a net income of $460,000 roughly. Then the last phase, really this is if you do the residential permit parking. So there's some small additional capital costs for that. There's the staffing goes up to 5 people, and the cost approaches $600,000. But again, the revenue by this point would be going up and could be approaching $1 million a year. So there'd be, again, $430,000 to $600,000 in revenue annually, given these projections. Now, I do need to mention to you that these were done, these projections were done when the economy was much better. And so if you did it right now, the revenue that you could expect would not be at these
Not so
levels.
much, yeah.
So,
Thank you for your presentation here.
yes, yeah. Okay. One more, I think. This just shows the revenue, so you can see how it grows. It's really during the short-term implementation, there is not very much revenue, and there's a lot of costs in the first phase of ramping up. And then after that, relatively quickly, you go to a steady state, pretty much where your costs and revenues are going up gradually over time, but fairly consistent. And finally, as far as the actual recommendations, the first one is we concur with the staff recommendation is that it's not, right now is not really a good time to move ahead with a program like this. It has a very negative connotation to it. The second thing is we do emphasize the phased implementation. I just can't tell you how many cities have resented or regretted the fact that they went whole hog into a program like this, and then they just have a lot of initial problems, and it backfires on them, and they end up having to take the whole thing out before they even really had a chance to see whether it worked or not. It's important also, and we identified in our plan, that the staffing that we talked about, that they actually be retained, because it's a program like this does require appropriate staffing, and there's a lot of other elements that are mentioned here. It's important to follow what other cities have done. We provided information on a number of them, but they're constantly, they have implemented programs like this in recent years, and their experiences are very important. And by the way, all three of the ones we mentioned there they're doing quite well with their programs. And then, but I keep saying it, but monitoring the program is extremely important, to not just assume that what was done at first is going to be the perfect solution, because it's not. You always have to monitor and change. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions from staff, from council? Oh, agency members?
I had a question on the map that you showed with the different designations of different kinds of parking.
Yeah.
I saw specifically that around Doyle Hollis Park, which is 61st and 62nd, it showed no parking. I was kind of curious. Currently we do have parking around there, and in terms, I know that habits will change.
There's a school on one side of the street there, I believe. So,
Kitty corner, across.
yeah.
But it was around the park is where there
It
was
was
no
around the
parking.
park itself, not around the school.
I know that that happens to be one block that's heavily impacted, and already there's a residential parking permit on one side of the street.
Okay, here we go.
Thank you. There. So it's the black rectangle, basically, around 61st, 62nd. And so, considering what is currently there's residential permit parking on one side. I wondered if there was a specific reason why it's designated as no parking.
Well, we actually, Terry, I
Also
don't know if
voted
you
not
know-
to
yeah, but
have
we
any
looked
parking
at,
around the park.
we actually looked at
Oh,
that.
from years ago, from
Yeah,
years
it-
past. So maybe it's a
Yeah.
leftover from
It's a
previous
leftover.
It
decisions.
might be, but there still is some parking there that's like loading zone parking for the school. Went by there this evening, as a matter of fact.
This,
so.
this plan was prepared before the park was finished, and so the
That's right.
proposal at that time was that when the park was finished, there would be no parking adjacent to it, but it would be across the street. So this plan reflects what the intention was at that time.
Thank you for the historical perspective. And secondly, one thing you'd mentioned with the residential parking permits is having a 2-hour visitor time limit, which I've seen in Oakland and Berkeley and other places. Interestingly, in our limited residential permit parking, we don't have any visitor time limit. Can you talk about that and the pluses and minuses of that, having the visitor time?
Well, the minus is, for one thing, the area that we're talking about really is pretty much a residential area, and so the minus is that the people that live there can't really have visitors that park on street. That's the area where you have the residential parking now is kind of a mixed residential commercial area, and so there, if you let people in, it's probably not residents, it's probably business people. So that, I think that's the difference.
Just the nature of a mixed-use
Right.
kind of area like that.
Right. We felt that, you know, again, the solution can be worse than the problem in some cases, so we didn't want to penalize the residents that much.
Yeah.
Okay. To begin with, when you say that this is not about revenue, I have to take exception to that because I don't think many people are going to believe that, especially when you have increasing rates. I mean, if you really just want the turnover, you don't need to keep increasing the rates over time. So it's really about how much you can get from it. You know, I've always been opposed to this kind of parking because one of the benefits you have in Emeryville is that somebody can come and visit you. You know, they don't have to run out and leave. They're not going to get ticketed. I mean, it creates a whole lot of additional problems. People protesting citations, and it just nobody likes this kind of parking enforcement. So if I don't get any other satisfaction out of this issue, I would want to make sure that we have a public hearing before the implementation of this plan. I would hate to adopt it now and then 5 years later, oh, well, we decided that a long time ago. That doesn't wash. When you're ready to implement this thing, that's the time to have a public hearing so you're getting feedback from the people before you implement this. You know, parking management in the city could include some other things. For example, if we don't want employees to park in the street, maybe we could create an employee parking garage, and maybe we could bus people there so they don't have to park in the street. There may be other ways to find solutions. Maybe some of the private parking that's available, maybe that could be used by some other businesses if we really explore that. And then I think we need a parking management plan when we have events, like when the school has an event. You know, we could have Plan A if there's going to be 500 people, Plan B if there's going to be 600 people. That's the kind of planning I think we need to see. We anticipate having events, so we should plan for that in advance. So I just have difficulty with the whole plan itself. So those are my comments.
Any other comments?
Yeah, Mayor Atkin, actually, I believe the staff recommendations should be accepted because until the economy recovers, many of the things that Councilmember Bukowski is talking about, the sensitivity of the public to any additional kind of economic burden is extreme. So I believe we should delay the implementation. And I think also, but we should also consider a CIP, consider it at the updating the CIP later this year. But I'd like to make a further comment, which really is not about this plan, but the information and the research that you've done here has really provided us with a very clear template of the city of where the real ouch places are, the red places, where there is an overuse of the public right-of-way in the parking capacity. And I think this is something that the council might want to refer to the Transportation Committee for a real thorough discussion of these areas that now we have really, we knew them intuitively, but now we have the objective information that says that this particular block is heavily impacted. We've got a map here, and we know where it is. Let's try to see if we can get an interim policy before we move to the parking meters with the use of my favorite, paint, to somehow control the parking problems. Would the council support that as an interim type of?
If the Transportation Committee hasn't already seen this or talked about it earlier, then yeah, it should go to them.
Yeah, as an interim, and instead of, because the Transportation Committee in the past several years has done this piecemeal, going to certain blocks where there's a problem, and created green zones or yellow zones. Let's take a look at it comprehensively and see if we can't come up with a better interim solution without charging the people for parking in the public right-of-way.
The other comment I just would like to make is that I appreciate your thought about how to utilize the off-street garages more effectively. And they're being underutilized, and the question is how do you encourage people who come for the day to work to get off the streets and into the garages. And I think
We'll do it.
the variable pricing is, I think, one strategy, and maybe the Transportation Committee, when they review this, could think about other ways to encourage greater utilization of the off-street garages.
Well, I could say one thing, that, when the Planning Commission approves these projects, if we didn't allow assigned spaces, if when we approve the parking, we say you can't have assigned spaces, then that parking would be much more effectively used. But once you got assigned space, it's sitting there empty all day waiting for Joe, whoever to show up, then it's underutilized.
I hate to say this, but being the newbie, one of the newbies on the council, I was kind of surprised to see this, especially parking meters in Emeryville. I thought that was a real surprise to me. But I see some merit in this from the standpoint of permitting, because I agree, we have too many people that don't fully understand the cost of parking on the street. So I would support some sort of permitting of workers so that they would be more of a tendency to take public transportation. I think that's the goal here, and are using, the parking garages.
But your permitting is generally supposed to protect residential parking, that you're trying to discourage the employer.
No, I understand that, but
Okay.
because right now, I live on 62nd Street, and I can tell you half the parking there during the day are people that work in town parking on 62nd Street.
Right.
So you can't have permitting in one part of the town without permitting another part of town, but the parking meters, as I said, I was shocked to see that.
Mayor Atkin, does the council support the staff recommendations?
Are we planning to hear from public on this item before we?
Anybody from the public wish to speak on this item? Okay.
Okay, I have a few more comments
Yes.
than to share. I want to applaud also the data collection in the plan. I think that's very important as we inform the decisions. And I actually see this as a great opportunity because I see that, and what I hear from residents is that, things are changing in terms of our dependence on automobiles, and I see this in many other plans in the city, the alternative transportation plan and the bike ped plan and the general plan in many places. So I think the changing of habits is what is hard, and I see this as something that would really serve the small businesses in town to have that increased turnover of parking spots. And again, to increase the utilization of the off-street private garages. I like very much the idea of the gradual implementation. When I counted it up, it looked like the first short-term parking spots is only 240 out of a total of 1,100 or 1,200 parking, so it's less than 20%. And instead of seeing it as a new tax, we could also see it as reducing a sort of subsidy that we have provided. When you look at our neighboring municipalities, I can't think of a shopping district that I go to where I don't pay for parking. We really stand out, I think, as a place that doesn't ask people to pay for parking. And as a result, we have residents who complain, number one, about congestion and traffic issues here. So trying to balance all of those needs and seeing that there's no net cost to the city, I think this seems like a really valuable thing to pursue in the capital improvement program that we will be discussing in a few months. I can go along with delaying the implementation of something like this, although I would like to know what measurable data we're waiting for, because I think if it's more objective in terms of, increase or change in sale tax, if that improves, what is the data? How are we going to measure the economy recovering? Because it, frankly, could be a really long time, and I think changing these habits now in small pieces as a gradual implementation is an excellent model to follow. So I guess I feel I can go along with the rest of the council in terms of the staff recommendations of putting it off, but I'm encouraged to do it sooner rather than later.
Would you support the idea of having a public meeting prior to implementation?
Oh, of course.
Okay, well, I think that's an important.
Yeah, and I think with the right information and talking about the trade-offs in terms of the data that's been presented, I think that the public would be very interested in this.
Let me tell you something. When we implemented the parking on 62nd Street and on 61st Street, we had people in these chambers we never saw before, and how dare you charge us to park in our neighborhood? I mean, this was the most packed place you've ever seen, and none of them were happy. The people that had to pay weren't happy, and the people that, you're trying to preserve the space. Well, they're angry yelling at you, mad because you're going to charge them for their space. So before you implement any of this stuff, you really want to make sure you
I agree. I see the public information piece and education and hearing and listening and responding to as very, very important. But I don't think we need to wait to change some of the habits in town so that people can actually use their cars and go to small businesses in town easily without having people parking there all day in a spot. Parking isn't free. Shouldn't be.
I support your comments, and I guess I would like to temper the staff recommendation about delaying until council can have another discussion about when is a good time to maybe start with the first phase or gradually implement this. And I guess I'll just make a little editorial. Economic recovery means different things to from different perspectives, and Wall Street is showing some signs. I mean, we're all talking about a jobless economic recovery, and maybe because of the issues here, we need to talk about a recovery that means job creation, not just stock performances or something like that, because the problems that happened in the north end of town happened because so many employees were coming in, and in that part of town there's not off-street parking for every residence, and some residents have to park on the street because they don't have any off-street parking, no driveways and that sort of thing. So I guess I would temper the staff recommendation to say until our daytime worker population shows demonstrable increases that create some pressure points again.
Well, the idea that if you have the public hearing, the public will let you know when it's time to implement it. The permanent parking problem started because Rich Robbins took the parking that he had at Heritage Square, and he totally leased that to somebody else. So all the residents that were across the street that were parking there, they were no longer allowed to park there. So we had to implement a parking permit program because he was charging for parking, and the people had nowhere to go if they had been used to parking there. So they came in here up in arms, and that's how we had to implement it. So that's why I say the thing about the assigned parking, because if that parking's there, it's meant for that building and those people. It's not meant for anything else. It's not meant to be leased out to somebody else. And so
I would say including the businesses and the managers of all of the off-street parking in that area would behoove us. It would be very smart to include them in all of the conversations. I didn't see the data that showed exactly how many spaces are vacant in the off-street parking garages. I don't know if that data was included in here, but I didn't. It is.
Well,
Okay.
as the public and the council have seen, we this issue of parking management touches a core for a lot of folks, and we've had a lot of discussion, and the discussion isn't over. But I want to thank you for coming, and I think the council's clear on both points of what the staff is requesting.
I'd like to suggest something here that, we could use these folks to help with a parking management plan for events at the school. I mean, because we want to show, we're going to have a joint use facility there, and we want to show how we're going to deal with these issues. And if we can at least get these folks involved in, well, how are we going to handle it if 1,000 people show up for an event or 500 people? Then we're making a statement that we're at least looking into these issues. I mean, they've done such a good job of identifying the issues here in the city that they could do a good job with that. So I just want to suggest that we consider using them to do that.
I don't know if we're clear, because I don't know if I really want to table this that long. What I'm looking for is I'm looking for some more input. And I'd love to have the businesses come up and tell us what they think about this, and the residents, because I think we need more input, and I can't decide this in a vacuum.
Okay?
All right.
Could we put this on an agenda, second one in October, something like that, so that we have time to make a public hearing? I guess we would need to do that at the next meeting, and then.
Well, I do want to follow up on Nora's suggestion that it goes to the Transportation Committee, because we could look at ways of doing things without charging anybody, so I think that makes a lot of sense to do that. And we can get it to the point where we're getting all the public input at the same time, but as a good first start, we should take it to the Transportation
I
Committee.
guess what I would suggest is that we have a Saturday workshop or something, take it out of the context of a council meeting and put it in the neighborhoods, maybe at Fire Station number 2 or something else where people can just come on their own leisure time. Weeknights, I think, are hard to get people out to a council meeting.
But are you really ready to implement any of the paid portions of this? You're going to start scaring people by doing that. I don't think you should do that right now. Let's first...
Yeah,
So, let's,
all right.
Let's gather the information.
okay.
Which information, just so we're specific, like measurements of sales tax in town? Is there some other way to determine?
What I'm saying is, let's gather the information from the people and see what the people want us to do, and not really worry about the cost of doing it. I think, let's look at the project for the right reasons, and not worrying about the money. If it's the right thing to do, then it's something we should look at doing.
But is that in terms of economic recovery?
No, that's
No.
in terms of this project.
So,
It's a
so,
sensitive
so
topic for
let,
parking,
let me
right?
be clear. You just want to gauge public opinion.
Yeah, no, I
That's
want
what
to
you want.
gauge, because I'm new on the council. I wasn't here when this went out and this RFQ went out. I'd like to know more about why this RFQ went out in the first place, why there was talk about parking meters, and then I'd like to understand the need. And if there's really a need, then I think that we should look at taking and implementing part of this plan. Now, the meters I have a tough time with, but there's other aspects I don't. Because I also believe that we need to get people into our parking garages and using more public transportation in town.
So if I could just interject here, Mayor, I think Councilmember Bukowski's concern about stirring up people if you're not ready to go forward with the project is an important one. Parking, as for those council members who have been on the council for a while, this is a real hot button issue. There's absolutely no winning. There are people who feel passionate on both sides, who want certain kinds of permits, who don't want other kinds of permits, who want parking rationed, they don't want it rationed, and so there's no easy outcome. So the basis of the staff recommendation was to wait and see whether or not this $1.3 million of capital expenditures, how that looks to you as decision makers in relation to all your other capital priorities. Does this type of regulation rise to the top? And if it does, through that discussion that you would have towards the end of this calendar year, then I think at that point, if you're willing to allocate money to it, then we could start a process of greater public participation and hearings and discussions with the neighborhood and all of that, and refine things in greater detail. But I think starting on that now is probably premature, because you may end up not wanting to go forward with it. And then just one last thought. I think I've heard two council members express measurements of economic recovery. Councilmember West expressed sales tax. I think that for small businesses like restaurants, that's a good indicator. You might want to, towards the end of this year, as you after you go through your capital improvement discussion, settle on some percentage increase in your sales tax revenues as a way of judging that. And then Councilmember Atkin talked about employee count, and the way that I think about that is office building occupancy. So right now we have fairly high occupancy, somewhere in the mid-teens. When we're healthy, we're below 10%.
Do you mean
You
vacancy?
mean vacancy?
Vacancy, I'm sorry.
Yeah, not occupancy.
And when it drops down below 10%, the vacancy, that's when we start to see the complaints come out about parking.
Right.
So if you use those two measures and wait for those to reach those thresholds, then I think you'll have a pretty good threshold to then begin public discussion.
Can I make one comment on that, which is just, I worry that without having any public discussion, that there will be, it sounds like, some fear around taking this seriously during the SIP budget deliberations because of that backlash maybe that you've experienced. So
There's
that's
been lots of public discussion,
about this.
starting in 2007.
Yeah.
Wasn't
Okay.
favorable either.
All right.
All right, I think, have we beat this horse
Well,
enough
but the one
tonight?
thing that Nora requested is that we, at the Transportation Committee, we look at this plan and see what we can do about, implementing.
Internet solution.
Right. So,
I'd go along with that.
okay, good. All right, so that was your, did you move approval to go with the staff with that change, right? And I'll second it.
Okay, I think that's a motion and a second.
Right.
Anybody opposed? No. Thank you for coming tonight. This takes